Hello and welcome to this presentation on noun phrases in Burmese. My name is Matthias Jenny and I'm giving this talk also on behalf of my colleague Rudolf Yanson. If you look at noun phrase modifiers in Burmese, there are a few things that just strike us from the very beginning. There are different ways of modifying nouns to form noun phrases, and the resulting noun phrases can be either headed or non-headed. Then the modifiers can either precede or follow the nominal head. We do get different stages, different degrees of lexicalization or conventionalized meanings in these modified noun phrases. And we also see differences in the grammatical boundness of noun phrases. So how closely, how tightly the modifier and the noun are bound in these patterns. In this talk, we want to look especially at three competing noun phrase patterns and their functions, and we want to answer the question whether there is a direct correlation between grammatical boundness and semantic integration, something that seems obvious to begin with, but may not be that obvious or that easily observed in all cases in Burmese. Brief overview of what we get in terms of noun phrase modifiers in the language. Non-headed modified noun phrases or complex noun phrases are of the type of teminje, a cook, which consists of rice and to cook, and there is no nominal head. Teminje is a person, but there is no noun here that would indicate the person. This kind is not productive and it's heavily lexicalized, so rather peripheral for our purposes here. Then, Burmese being a verb final, head final language, you do get pre-head modifiers as expected, and you get noun phrases like bianca, a racing car, which consists of the verb to compete and the nominal head car. You do get different types of these, and especially important here is the last one, the verb and the attributivizer, GDA, a big house, which is the stative verb G, to be big, with the attributive marker de, and then the head noun house at the end. Then, maybe a bit unexpectedly, you also get post-head modifiers, modifiers that stand after the nominal head. And here we get three basic kinds. We get reduplicated verbs like AGG, a rather big house, a quite big house. You can have a plain verb as a modifier, as in Luzhu, a bad guy. Or you can have a nominalized verb as a modifier, like in AG, a big house, which consists of the nominalized verb G with the normalizing prefix a. The three kinds that are of special interest to our purposes in this talk are the ones in red here. So the verb with the attributive marker, post-nominal plain verb, and post-nominal nominalized verb. We want to have a look at these three types because they are similar in meaning. They are in some cases mutually interchangeable, but not always. So we want to see what is the internal structure of these types? How are they made up? How can we explain the differences in distribution? And the question we especially want to answer, is there a correlation between the internal structure and the distributional pattern? Distributional pattern being something semantic, so we want to see whether the syntactic grammatical form correlates with the semantics of these noun phrases. The first one, verb, attributive marker, and then the noun, so the prenominal verbal modifier. This actually can be seen as a sort of relative clause, prenominal relative clause, index expected, position, before the nominal head. And the verb here actually is a full verb phrase or even a full clause. We can get all the clausal elements like adverbials, you can get tense aspect, modality, polarity, you can have all the arguments like subject, objects, fully overtly expressed in these constructions. These attributive verbs and nouns as a noun phrase are fully productive, apart from semantic restrictions, of course, like semantic clashes. They're fully transparent in their semantics, so there's no idiosyncratic meaning involved there. And they can be used in all cases of attribution, so the property can be momentary, can be permanent, can be anything, which of course makes sense because you also can add the tense aspect markers. So there is low syntactic integration because these elements, these modifying elements, just function like clauses basically. There is no close integration semantically. There is no idiosyncratic or lexicalized meaning there. These are highly productive, of course. It's just an open pattern. And we can take this as being something syntactic rather than morphological. The next pattern is the noun followed by a nominalized verb. And here we also get fully productive patterns, and they're fully transparent semantically. We don't get idiosyncratic meaning there. We don't get lexicalization there. There is a restriction, though, to stative verbs, verbs that are adjective equivalents in European languages. These are used mainly or probably only with permanent and or inherent properties of the noun, so not momentary properties. The nominalized verb does not take any verbal modifiers, no tense aspect, polarity is possible there. And the nominalized verb never gets voiced, voicing in Burmese being a sign of close juncture, of close boundness in some way. It's a bit tricky, this voicing, but it is generally seen as a sign of close juncture. So here we do get pretty low integration grammatically and semantically. And the grammatical low integration can also be seen from the fact that this nominalized verb can be separated from the noun, or it can even occur independently without the noun. So they function like two independent elements in the clause. And the third pattern we want to look at here is noun followed by a plain verb. This also seems to be a productive pattern, but here we do get fixed meanings, idiosyncratic meaning changes, so they're not always fully transparent semantically. Like the nominalized verbs as modifiers, these patterns are restricted to stative verbs, and they're used only with permanent or inherent properties of the noun. Unlike the nominalized post-nominal verbs, though, these plain verbs as modifiers are always directly adjacent to the noun. So here we do get a high integration grammatically and semantically. And actually, dictionaries, Burmese monolingual dictionaries or Burmese to other languages, treat these patterns differently. So they list some of these NV noun phrases as lexemes, not others, and other dictionaries list another set of these NV patterns. So there is quite some discrepancy in handling the lexical status of these patterns. If we look at the distribution or the meaning of these, we see that in many cases, the verb plus attributive marker in prenominal position is quite equivalent to the post-verbal nominalized verb, but it's not the same as the post-verbal plain verb as a modifier. So if you have an expression like haunde mu, the old town, an old town, we can paraphrase this as a town which is old. This is pretty much the same as 묘하오, but it's not the same semantically as 묘하오. 묘하오 is often used in place names, so it has a more specific meaning. It's more like a proper noun rather than a general noun. This may be even more prominent in the case of Daembu, which is a street in Yangon. So this is a place name, whereas Pyudete or Daepu is just a white ordination hall. In other cases though, like the last example here, Dijin is quite the same as Dijin. And if you Google these, you do get hundreds of thousands of hits for both of them. And there doesn't seem to be a difference in meaning or usage. The distributional overlap is also evident if you just Google around a bit. And for example, the expression, all the new car sales, you get both ka ahau ka ate yangwe jin, or you get ka ahau ka ate ayangwe. So you see, you can have either plain verb or normalized verb modifying the noun in the same context, and they seem to really have the same meaning. In other cases, you can only use one of these possibilities, like the second example on the bottom here. If you say, I have to buy a new car, the old one is not good anymore, you would rather use the nominalized verb as a modifier and not the plain verb or the prenominal relative clause. This table just sums up the features of these three patterns that we have seen. And well, we can see that the first ones are less closely bound grammatically, and they seem less closely bound semantically than the last one. So far, things are still what we would expect to be. Now we have to take a closer look at the NAV, the noun followed by a normalized verb, to check the internal structure, because this is not really clear. Now this prefix a is a general nominalizer in Burmese. So if you have the verb ji, to be big, you get a ji, the bigness or the size. From the verb bya, to speak, you get a bya, speech, the speaking. So this a just nominalizes any verb, basically. So one possible analysis would be to take a compound or a noun phrase like ka aji, the big car, as something like underlyingly car bigness, the car's bigness. And this is actually how some authors have analyzed these. This would be consistent with the morphosyntactic structure of Burmese, of course, because then we just take the normalized verb as the head, and the noun, the plain noun preceding it, would be kind of a nominalizer. So it's not the car that is the head, but the bigness. It's a car-like bigness. There are some problems though with this analysis. First, the semantics doesn't really fit, because ga-aji is a kind of car, another kind of bigness. So semantically, ga, car, is the head. Then you can drop either the n or the normalized verb. So which one is the head? We cannot really tell from this. If you take it as a given that heads cannot be dropped, well, none of them is a head. And then another semantic fact here that comes into play, the classifier is always determined by the noun and not by the AV. And the Burmese classifiers, the choice of classifiers is always determined by the semantics of the head. So if ga-a-ji has a G as a head, we wouldn't expect the vehicle classifier C to occur with this expression, but it does. So this analysis doesn't really seem to make much sense. An alternative analysis would be that the nominalized verb is not only the bigness, like an abstract, but it can also be the big one, the V1. In this case, the noun followed by nominalized verb would not be a headed noun phrase, but rather it would be an appositional relationship here. So ga a G is then car, the big one, or a big one. And a de is house, a new one. It will be something like car is a topic and a G just adds something. Appositional. This is then fine with the classifier, because the choice of classifier, of course, goes with the semantics of either car or the big one, and the big one is also a car in this case. And the order of elements is no problem, because then we don't have a post-nominal modifier, we just have two independent nouns in appositional position. So if we accept this analysis, this explanation, and we have a short look at the possible development, possible explanation of the state of affairs that we find today in Burmese, noun followed by a plain verb seems to be the oldest form that you get in Burmese. You already find it in old Burmese inscriptions, and this is probably the default choice. It has been around for the longest time, so it had most time to develop conventionalized idiosyncratic meaning and undergo lexicalization in some cases. Noun followed by a nominalized verb, as in car, the big one, may be a more recent innovation. It's just two juxtaposed nominals, independent nominals. But this expression may replace the original default NV in some cases, especially when there is a potential conflict because the original NV has become lexicalized, has acquired idiosyncratic meaning, is not transparent anymore. And this depends on the subjective judgment of individual speakers. So some speakers may prefer NV, others may prefer to replace this by an nominalized V. And this is where we get the little bit messy picture sometimes that especially foreign language learners may feel. Burmese don't seem to hesitate which form to use. And then the attributive verb preceding a noun is a pattern that is always available. It's not always the most idiosyncratic form or the most idiomatic form, I have to say. So this is technically available, but not usually the preferred form, especially if the property is not the permanent or inherent property of the noun. A further source, more recent source possibly, of NV patterns could be that in colloquial varieties in spoken Burmese, the nominalizing tends to be dropped, especially if it's found in the second part of a compound. So if you have expressions like a meeting, a convention, a see away, you do get a see away with the in the second part of the compound dropped. And if you Google this, you get millions of hits for this, and mostly in non-formal contexts. So this means that N followed by a nominalized verb can become noun followed by a plain verb in some substandard colloquial contexts by dropping this Voicing in this case does not occur regularly, but then, as I mentioned before, voicing is not really a good diagnostic for syntax in Burmese, because it's not regular and it's subject to heavy individual and regional differences. So this newly introduced NV patterns, they compete with original NV pattern, and they're probably also blocked when there is an original NV that has acquired a more idiosyncratic lexicalized meaning, which has become less transparent. We see then that the noun followed by a plain verb is the oldest form. It is the most closely bound, both semantically and grammatically. It behaves like a compound noun, basically. Then the probably more recent NAV pattern is less closely bound grammatically and semantically, but as this may turn into NV in colloquial language, this can lead to a discrepancy between the grammatical and semantic boundness, because it looks like it's grammatically more bound, but semantically it's still free in the way that it's fully transparent without idiosyncratic semantic development. And the attributive verb followed by a noun, this is very loosely bound semantically and grammatically. So this doesn't pose a problem at all. Thank you very much for your interest. And if you have any comments or questions, we'll be very happy to take them. You have our email addresses here.